Great to see so many people attending the webinar, and just thought it might be a good time to say thanks for the Institute of Internal Auditors for arranging access to information in what seems to be a really effective way of sharing insights and perspectives over a webinar. So well done, guys. It's good stuff. So thanks for logging in. As Michael said, I have quite a bit of experience in the internal audit space, around the audit function at Post for almost 12 years, I think, and done lots of other things, and spent quite a bit of my time working with people in the people development space. In fact, last Thursday and Friday, myself and Andrew Brown ran a program for the Institute in terms of the Understanding and Applying Soft Skills program that we present on behalf of the Institute, which was a lot of fun and lots of interesting perspectives shared over those 2 days. So what's interesting in terms of those programs that I run both for the Institute and for organisations in the audit and risk space, I spend a lot of time in that people development area, in terms of focusing on those areas in relation to audit teams. And when I ask people the question, who wants to be a trusted advisor, who is a trusted advisor, everyone puts their hand up so that they want to be a trusted advisor, or certainly have aspirations for being a trusted advisor. And it's a very interesting question, and a very interesting topic that I hope to share some insights with you today on. So just look at a roadmap, and as Michael said, feel free to ask any questions as we go through. We have probably about 50 slides. We can skip through those relatively quickly. Some of them are, will take a bit longer than others, because we introduce some interesting concepts. But certainly I'm happy to hear any questions you can type through, and I'll endeavour to get to those as we go through the hour. So the roadmap for our session is looking at the question, are you perceived as a trusted advisor? To what extent do you love the internal audit function? What some of the recent research into the profession is, and what some of the lessons or focus areas that come out of that. And at point 4, what trusted advisors do and that others don't do. We look very broadly at capability development, and in this space of heading towards trusted advisor status, a lot of the underlying, and you'll see this through the course of the next hour, a lot of the underlying work is in that capability development space, particularly around communication, influence and relationships, as it says in point 6. But also thinking about increasing complexity, because we do live in what's known as a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous increasingly. So we'll talk a little bit about how you navigate, what are some of the strategies to navigate increasing complexity, and talk specifically about something called the integral framework that I use with Andrew and others when we consult into organisations around looking at capability development and driving perspective, which is really important for an audit function, because we do work at the apex of organisations with significant access to directors and senior executives, and we're in a very privileged position in many ways, and having the ability to take perspective, a clear perspective as to what your organisation is doing internally, but in terms of how it integrates with the global economy, is important for us as auditors. So we're going to talk a little bit about integral, and then in point 9, growing into a trusted advisor and what that means for you. I'll just flip across to the second slide. So, are you perceived as a trusted advisor? We ask this question in a lot of our programs, and this 4-quadrant model is something that Phil Tarling, who was the former chairman of the IIA in, I think, 2012-13, presented at a conference, and it talks to that issue of the extent to which we're able to move from being perceived as a compliance function and into that role of trusted advisor. One of the key points around working into that trusted advisor quadrant is, it does require significant levels of systems and people thinking. Just want to check, do we have audio? I've got a few messages that we're not having audio, and I've got some sound in my headset that suggests maybe we don't. No, we do.
All right. All right, I can hear you now, David.
The trusted advisor space does certainly take a lot more systems and people thinking, and importantly in this space, emotional intelligence is twice as important, or at least more, probably more than twice as important as technical competence, which is very interesting when it comes to looking at how internal audit is, the capability is assessed. Often we tend to focus on our technical skills, and yet if we want to move into the trusted advisor space, it's not so much the technical skills that get us there. It's important, and we must have them, obviously. But oftentimes it's so the broader skills that are important to get us towards that trusted advisor space. So looking at our profession, we're very fortunate, as I said. We do work at that apex of the organisation, and we have an opportunity to significantly influence the vitality of our organisation. So we're in a really great position to, generate value for ourselves and generate value out of the way the function operates. And, the question is, do you love being an internal auditor? Well, I certainly loved it when I was working in audit. We certainly bring a lot of strengths to the profession, but, as we know, not many people like being audited. And I certainly didn't like being audited when I was, even in my role as chief auditor, we'd every 2 or 3 years we'd have a quality assurance review, and sometimes it was a little uncomfortable. So, being audited is not necessarily or can be perceived to be as an uncomfortable experience, and that, puts us into a position behind the 8 ball. And oftentimes we, folks will perceive audit as, do you think maybe internal auditors are seen in this way, where this guy is saying, what the hell is wrong with you people? Of course I've got people skills. But certainly in terms of how we're sometimes perceived, given the nature of our role, it does put us behind that relationship 8 ball to some extent. So, we do, in the organisation, sometimes can be perceived in a way that perhaps we wouldn't necessarily like to be perceived. So the question is for us is, how do we not take it personally? How do we build those trusted and mutually beneficial relationships with our clients? How do we cultivate the personal and collective capability as a function to maintain and leverage relationships? And how do we go about navigating towards that trusted advisor status? So let's talk about a few of the recent research reports into the profession, and you'll notice there's lots of firms. I've gathered a few snapshots of reports from PwC, Protiviti, EY and others, and these tend to be produced on an annual basis, with a snapshot of where the profession's heading and some of the latest trends are. And what's interesting about the research, it's very consistent, particularly in this area of relationship and communication. So it's a relationship and a communication business. Audit is a part of a complex web of relationships. It requires high levels of emotional and social intelligence to be successful. Mastering interpersonal and communication skills is among the most important capabilities that a successful auditor needs. In this VUCA, complex, challenging VUCA environment, the soft attributes of audit performance are increasingly critical to success. That came out of, I think, a PwC report a couple of years back. Let me just click this. So as the role of internal audit evolves and stakeholder expectations increase, the competencies required exceed more than just traditional technical skills. The most effective auditor possesses a broad range of non-technical, in addition to deep technical expertise. So we're not saying technical skills are not important, are absolutely critical, but increasingly it's these broader people skills that are important to our ability to stay close to company leadership. This is one thing I learned very clearly in my chief auditor role at Post, that the closer you can get to the leadership team and the more closely you can align with the key strategies of the organisation, the more likely it is that you'll be heading towards that trusted advisor status, and importantly, the more likely it is that you're going to be relevant to your stakeholders. So what do trusted advisors do that others don't? So there's lots of research, and if you Google this, you'll be able to pull research around what is a trusted advisor. But if you look at this chart, it's very clear that if you look at the right-hand column from the red, heading left, there's a lot of statements here, and this is based on a survey of customers. This is not based on a survey of auditors. This is based on a survey of customers as to what was important to those customers, and particularly customers who thought their consultants or the auditors were, were perceived to be trusted advisors. And if you look at the right-hand side, it's about communication. It's about initiative. It's about being customer-oriented or customer-focused. It's about showing courage and confidence, business acumen, big picture perspective. And right down to the bottom, really important, but not as important as a whole range of other things, is technical skills. And what's interesting in that, if you look at the capability programs and the development programs out there for auditors, they tend to be, I'd say about 90% of them tend to be technically focused. But if you're looking to become a trusted advisor, this chart in particular suggests we may need to think about how much time we spend into some of these other areas if we want to become that trusted advisor. Because it's about communication, it's about getting in the shoes of your customers, it's about showing confidence and courage, and it's about business acumen and initiative. So really important non-technical attributes that we need to think about. And as I just said, in terms of the black column at the left-hand side, this is the traditional focus, or the traditional development focus, where auditors spend a lot of time. And we need to do that, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff along the heading right from that black column that suggests we need to do a bit more in some of these other areas. So moving towards trusted advisor status involves personal and collective growth into many of these soft spots identified in the research. So it's not about adding another app to your technical toolkit. It's more about investing in your communication, your influencing, your relationship management, your strategic thinking capabilities. It's about extending your thinking beyond traditional analytical thinking. It's not discounting analytical thinking, it's not discounting technical skills. It's focusing on these other areas of your capability toolkit that are going to be needed for you to approach that trusted advisor status with your customers. So if we're talking about capability, there's a couple of aspects of capability that I'd like to talk about. Just got a question here, which is a really interesting question. Let me just answer that while and the question is this not reflective of the stage of maturity or position the auditor will be in? Well, it certainly is reflective of that. And we're going to talk very specifically about those stages right now. So there's two forms of learning that you need to be aware of. There's something called horizontal learning, and this is about competence development. And this is about more information, skills and competencies, and it increases what you know and strengthens your technical expertise. And as we just said in the chart, the black column is important, but for most customers it's the least important aspect of your capability set. Now, horizontal learning is this typical audit, risk and compliance training, and it's really essential for using known techniques to solve clearly defined problems. And it's about developing that functional knowledge and the skills and behaviours, and that's pretty important stuff. And that's typically the stuff we learn through college, and as we move into the earlier phases of our audit careers, we're really focusing in on those technical skills, and that's a basic. You have to have that. Moving towards that trusted advisor status, it actually requires a lot more than technical skills, as that graph before showed. And it's talking about something quite different to horizontal learning. It's actually talking about something called vertical learning. And this is about mindset transformation. This is about more complex and sophisticated ways of thinking. And it's about improving how you think, how you interpret any situation. When I reported to the CEO at Australia Post, Graham John at the time, I remember a meeting I had with him. And one of the things he said to me, he said, "David, one of the things I look for in my leaders is their ability to handle ambiguity and complexity and hold differing perspectives and often different polarities at the same time." And this is one of the challenges of vertical learning in terms of mindset, being able to handle more complex and sophisticated ways of thinking. And this is critical for an audit function, and critical for you if you want to approach this trusted advisor status in your organisation. And this vertical learning is about looking at how you address complex problems, how you cultivate high-stakes relationships. And we have plenty of those as auditors in organisations. How we navigate rapidly changing, uncertain circumstances, and an increasingly, turbulent world we live in. Things change very quickly. We know that. We can feel it every day almost, particularly with new technology. And vertical learning is about developing your mental complexity and your emotional intelligence, and it's about basically about upgrading your internal operating system, for more wisdom and care. So this is really important in that in the way we think and how we think about audit and how we do things in an organisation. And as one of the questions we got earlier suggested, this is about maturity. And as humans, we tend to go through levels of development. As this chart suggests, there's three core stages of vertical development. You'll know when you look at children, children tend to work through naturally various stages of development as they go from babies through to toddlers through to 8, 10-year-olds and into teenage years. There's a very clear development trajectory. As we become adults, this tends to flatten out for a lot of people, and we need to put in more work to move through these stages. And if we look to the left of the chart, the level of development over time, we've got something called dependent or conformer. And these folks typically are at that level where you're a good team player, a good follower, you're reliant on authority or the boss. You look for direction and you tend to align with other people around you. So you've got this dependent level of thinking. Nothing wrong with that, but that's just where a lot of people sit. As you move up towards this, to the right-hand side of the chart, you move into this stage called independent and achiever stage of vertical development. And your thinking moves and changes so that you're more independent in your thinking. You're more self-directed, you tend to drive an agenda, you take a stand for what you believe in, which is important, and you're guided by your internal compass. So you're not so much seeking the direction from your boss or from your organisation. You're not so reliant on authority, you're more free-form in terms of your thinking and your self-guiding. And then you move up to potentially, not everyone gets there, but you can move up to this next phase called interdependent or collaborator phase. This is the interdependent thinker. It's about seeing systems more broadly, patterns and connections, that long-term thinking, holding a multi-frame perspective. So this reflects on what my CEO said to me about holding ambiguity and complexity in your mind at the same time, and holding those contradictions, being able to navigate through those contradictions and challenges at the same time, holding those different perspectives. And this is really important as a senior auditor, but in terms of moving through those stages, it's really important to move through those levels of thinking and development if we want to get to that trusted advisor status in an organisation. Because what is true is that when you're dealing with senior executives have to deal with highly complex issues all the time. And if you're looking to advise and work with those people in an effective way, you need to understand the challenges they have. So you need to be able to think in a similar manner and be able to handle those complexities at the same time as your customers and clients do. What's interesting is a lot of research done by Harvard and other places around how senior leaders handle complexity and the growing complexity in global markets. And this chart talks to those levels of complexity and the level of development required to handle them. But what it does say is that as you move through your organisational levels in terms of different roles, the complexity gap increases. So without deep interventions in looking at how you develop your thinking skills, often you can be in a role that may be well beyond you. And certainly I've seen lots of examples of that in organisations where people who have been really technically very sound in their technical activities have been promoted into leadership positions, and oftentimes have struggled quite significantly in that, because it's as you move into those leadership skills, it's not technical skills that are important, it's how you do people, how you do the people skills, and how you do leadership in an organisation. And I certainly learnt through my career, particularly as a chief auditor, that, and as I started, my skill set as I started compared to where I ended was completely different. I learned a lot of stuff over the journey, particularly about myself. So what we talk about when we're looking at vertical development is, and when we talk about horizontal development is, horizontal development is like pouring water into a glass. It's new audit, compliance, risk training, learning how to do those technical things well. And to a certain level, you can put as much water into a glass and it then starts overflowing. The analogy is for vertical development, however, is to expand the size of your glass so that you have the capability to hold more information and hold more complexity in your mind and deal with complex issues, but also deal with the technical issues as well. So it's important to recognise that vertical learning is about expanding the size of your glass to be able to think differently. Now, some interesting research into people development and as it applies to internal audit. If you look at this circumplex, this is a circumplex developed by the Leadership Circle. And what it talks to is the broad areas. If you look around the circumplex, we start at the bottom in protecting, complying, relating, self-awareness, authenticity, systems awareness, achieving and controlling. If you look at the bottom part of the circle where it says protecting, controlling, and into the achieving area perhaps, this tends to be where often internal auditors thought as in terms of living. We tend to be we tend to look at, protecting the organisation and controlling things, to be compliance, control, and, monitoring, and they're all very important attributes, obviously. But what's interesting in this research, if I can just click this forward, if you look at the top part of the circle, these are relating, self-awareness and authenticity. These tend to be creative and relationship attributes. And they're somewhat related to those attributes that the trusted advisor graph we showed earlier, what trusted advisors do. They tend to be focused into these areas. It's about communication and relationships and working very closely with your clients. And what this chart again shows is, on the right-hand side of this chart, it shows something called leadership effectiveness and business performance. What's interesting about this chart is that if you look at the scatter chart on the right-hand side, there's quite a significant plot around those leaders that are perceived to be more effective. They tend to have attributes, as I've circled in the circumplex. They tend to have attributes which talk to the issue of relating. It's about self-awareness and authenticity and a broader systems awareness, which are these abilities to handle complexity. It's the abilities to work very closely and well with and lead people, and it's in these creative attributes that higher levels of leadership performance result in better business performance. And I think this is probably quite closely related to how we work as auditors, or how we can be more successful as auditors. So the research shows a very high correlation between individual development maturity, creative leadership attributes, and personal effectiveness, particularly in dealing with increasing uncertainty, ambiguity, and volatility. So pretty important in terms of you guys moving through to trusted advisor status in your organisations. And very relevant for the role of internal audit in our role as working at the apex of organisations and dealing with the board and senior management. So we need to move into these creative attributes of our capability set. So this is about dealing with the traditional left-hand side of the brain, which is the logic, the analytical skills, and the traditional audit and compliance stuff. How we integrate that well with the freer flow right-hand side of the brain, the passion, the creation, the communication and relationship skills, and how you integrate those two very effectively, the left and right, into a whole. So it's a more holistic approach. So just talking to those issues of communication, influence, and relationships, as trusted advisors do those things very well. Certainly one of the bigger problems in organisations that we find, myself and Andrew Brown, as I said, we do work with the Institute in terms of the soft skills programs, but in terms of other consulting that we do to organisations, we find there's a common issue around people don't really communicate that well, so people tend to communicate very poorly. As Lee Iacocca said, one of the great CEOs around the place, his view is that communication is everything. And in terms of internal audit, that's it's probably a fairly accurate comment. That communication is everything. It's very important. If you want to become a trusted advisor, you've got to be great. Not just great, you've got to be fantastic at communication. And I mean that in terms of face-to-face or interpersonal, but also formal reporting, etc. And I've certainly, in my work experience, seen examples of these sorts of communication in the workplace. I'm sure perhaps you have too, where communication probably isn't that effective. Now, just on communication, what's interesting, Harvard did a really interesting piece of work and published something in the last month, which basically says we're not very self-aware in the workplace, which touches on the issue of communication and relationships. And what it says is that high self-aware teams or high self-aware people are just more effective at handling conflict, better at coordination, better at decision quality. So high self-awareness is pretty important, and that's one of the key factors of emotional intelligence, as you'll probably be aware. But certainly that's all about also how we do communication with our customers. So the question is, where do we begin? Well, we look at communication, influence, and relationships. And one of the key points to recognise is that as individuals we are all actually quite unique. So developing more effective communication and relational capacity begins with a recognition that each of us is unique and different, absolutely unique and different. We all have our own behavioural style, which we use on a daily basis with varying degrees of effectiveness. What's interesting though is our communication and behaviour is based on what our individual needs are. Now we all have needs, and they tend to sit at the bottom of this iceberg. I'm sure a lot of you will have seen the whole person concept. So at the top of the iceberg, as you'll know, is your behaviour and your communication. This is what people see of you. However, under the iceberg is where most of the real work is going on. But how we think and how we feel drives how we behave and how we communicate. And of course, our values and beliefs, which are all unique, and we all have individual upbringings, value sets, potentially religious, cultural backgrounds that drive our values and beliefs, that then drive how we think and feel, and then manifest in how we behave and communicate. But sitting underneath those is what we need as individuals. Now these all link in a chain, and your needs essentially drive how you behave and how you communicate in the workplace. So I do quite a bit of work with teams around behaviour and communication, and we do a bit of work around surfacing what your particular needs are. And so the question is, what are your needs? And we do a bit of work using the DISC profile. Some of you may be aware of what DISC is, in fact, and may have used it before. But DISC is basically what we call a user guide to people. And it's a really great way of surfacing what your individual behaviour and communication style is. And it's a needs-driven behaviour and communication model. And if you're looking at your customers and your teammates, what is really important, if you want to have more effective relationships, if you want to do communication more effectively, you need to understand what your teammates' needs are and what your customers' needs are. Now, we did a lot of work in this space at Australia Post with our team, so that we understood each other more effectively. But just as importantly, we did a lot of work looking at our customers and what DISC profile they would have been, that we perceived they would be, in terms of what their communication and relational type was, and what their needs were. We found this particularly valuable in terms of how we developed communication strategies with our customers and with our teammates. If you look at this DISC circumplex, you'll see there's a D, an I, an S, and a C, and these indicate certain behavioural styles. And let me just click forward. Underneath those styles, basically there's two basic needs that influence how people behave in relation to one another. And this is the need for affiliation and the need for control. So this drives your behaviour, one of these key needs. The need for affiliation, which is about being around and with people, and the need for control, which is about controlling stuff and being looking after things and driving to results. So if you look at the top left quadrant, there's something called D. It's about challenge, results, and action. And D stands for dominant. So if you're a D, you have a dominant style. You really love driving for results. Now, I had people in my workplace who were really key drivers, and they love driving to results. One of the challenges with people who have this D orientation is they're not so people focused. So they're very task focused and can often, could be a bit more effective in terms of how they deal with people-related issues and how they communicate. People who are I tend to be action enthusiastic and very collaborative, and they're all about I'm a high I in my behavioural style, so I like having lots of cups of coffee with people, doing relationships well, and talking to people about what's happening with people. People who are S tend to be in that support space, and that's about being supportive and steady, and they love working with people, but they love process and doing things at a steady pace. People who are in that C domain are very detail focused and they're very task oriented. So if you look at the D's and the C's, they're about the task and about the control aspects. People who are in the I's and S categories are more about affiliation, so more about people orientation. Now, we tend to have a mix of all these aspects in our behavioural style, but we each tend to be one or more of these, one in particular of these particular domains which drives how we deal with communication and how we deal with relationships. So when you can surface your own particular DISC style, it does give you a lot of insight into in terms of yourself and some self-awareness. But in particular, it identifies the uniqueness in ourselves and other people, which is really important. Because what we're trying to do is when we communicate with people is understand their needs and communicate in a way that resonates for them. This is the key. So if you're in this D category, you can be strong-willed, independent, practical, decisive, and efficient. That's how you can be seen. On the other side, the flip side of that, you can be seen as sometimes pushy or tough-minded or dominating. So I had some people in my team who were pretty high in this D domain, and one of the challenges they had, one of the good things was that they really drove their projects and they delivered, really great audit files and great results, etc. But they weren't so good at, in terms of self-awareness, or at how they dealt with other people. And sometimes they could be seen, particularly by people who are in this steadiness or conscientiousness domain, as being a bit pushy and tough-minded. And what happened is that one or two of those folks, they sort of burned some people along the journey, and other folks didn't want to work with them, which made it a little bit problematic when we were trying to do projects and with teams. So it was important that we were able to surface some of the issues around your individual behavioural style and how that impacts on other people, and that was very useful to greasing the wheels of the way the team operated. And if we walk through these various other categories, the influencing category, which is where I tend to sit in my preferred behavioural style, and the steadiness and conscientiousness categories. Each of these categories has great qualities and some shortcomings where there's areas to think about in terms of improvement. So one of the things we did with our audit team at Post is we looked at how all of these DISC categories work together as a team. We understood how to better relate. So with this person who might have been a high C, how they could better relate to a person who was a high D, and what the specific communication style might be, or how you could communicate more effectively with a person who was a high D, and vice versa, how a person who was a high D can more effectively communicate with someone who was a high C in their behavioural and communication preferences. So this helped quite significantly in how we worked as a team, but equally as importantly, it worked really well in terms of how we designed communication with our key customers in the organisation. So interestingly, around DISC, it's about describing behaviour. It's not about measuring behaviour. Your DISC style is based on your interpersonal psychology. Influences how you interact with people. It's not for labelling, but it's more about understanding. And there are no good or bad styles in DISC. They all have strengths and limitations, and everyone tends to be a mixture of all those styles. And this is an example of a DISC chart. If you were to do a DISC questionnaire survey, a short 20 or 30 question survey, it then plots you in terms of where your preferences lie. And I remember when I first got my DISC report many years ago, it was a 20-page report, and I was looking at it and I was thinking, how do they know all this information about me? It's very interesting. So DISC is a very useful tool to surface your behavioural style and your communication style, but as a way in terms of a team and as your customer set, looking at your customers and looking at where they might sit in the plot of a DISC chart, and therefore how to then target your communication to meet their needs and therefore get more cut through. And we found this to be very successful, a very really effective and successful way of dealing with our customers in a more effective way at Australia Post. So your behaviour and communication and relationship development approach is like the tip of the iceberg. This is what people experience of you. It's right at the top of the iceberg, but there's a whole bunch of stuff going on under the surface that's driving your behaviour and communication. And what trusted advisors do, teams and individuals of trusted advisors, they manage their behaviours. Each individual manages his or her own behaviours, and they help other people manage theirs. This is what good teams do. They look after each other, but they understand how other people do communication, what their particular style is, and they match their style to become more effective communicators. And if you want to become that trusted advisor, this is a key point. You have to be fantastic at communication. So by first understanding how and why we behave, we can then begin to understand others and then build better teams and more effective relationships, both in your team, but equally as importantly with your customers. So this is critical for an effective internal audit function. And if you want to move towards trusted advisor status, you've got to be fantastic at relationships. You've got to be great at communication. And when you do those things, you can then have more influence. Because if you can tap into your customer base, if you can communicate most effectively, and if you can listen to your customers and walk a mile in their shoes, you're going to be able to build trust. And trust is critical with any relationship, and you'll know this from your personal relationships. Trust takes a long time to build, but it's very easily lost. So being able to do and have a clear sense of your communication style and how to do communication and relationships better enables you to, gives you a platform to move towards trusted advisor status in organisations. Now when it comes to issues of self-awareness, it's, I don't know, some of you may have heard of the Johari's window, and this is really important because this is about self-awareness. And if you look at the top left quadrant, this is called known to self. This is what you know about yourself, but it's also what others can see of you. And we have aspects of that in our behaviour and our how we work that people can see of us. What's of course under the iceberg that people don't see of you, that you know, this is what you hide from people, and we all do that. Because we wear masks when we go to work, and we don't necessarily share a lot of things about ourselves in the workplace with our teammates. But we know there's a lot of stuff under the surface and in the iceberg, and you know, that's not unusual. What's interesting in this little model is that what others can see things of you that you cannot necessarily see of yourself. So you have a blind spot, and when you're working in a team, others will know things about your behaviour and your communication style and how you do what you do that maybe you don't see in yourself. And this is an example of where I mentioned the lady, or the person who worked with me at Post, who was great at driving towards outcomes, but probably wasn't so good at how she communicated and dealt with others in the workplace. So she had a blind spot around her impact with other people in terms of that relationship piece. So this is an example of that blind spot. So others can see things of you that you can't necessarily see of yourself. And one of the other really interesting aspects of the Johari's window, there's a lot of things in you that you are not aware of. There's a lot of things in you that other people are not aware of as well. And in the learning programs that myself and Andrew Brown present, we do work in that space a little bit about unpacking what you don't know. And that's where there's a lot of juice in terms of that vertical development space that I talked of a little bit earlier in the presentation. A lot of that vertical development stuff is about surfacing the unknown that you have of yourself. So just taking a slightly sideways turn here about that context of growing complexity. I talked about it a bit earlier. Important as a trusted advisor that you are in that headspace where you're able to deal with complexity, because our customers have to deal with it. A recent study by IBM highlighted that CEOs worldwide, one of their biggest issues is this question of growing complexity, this perpetual whitewater. So this issue of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And if you want to be a trusted advisor, you need to be able to navigate your way through these issues. And as Jeff Barnes, the head of global leadership at GE, stated, there are no boundaries anymore. It's such a complex world, so much changing all the time. Anything, you know, you sneeze in London, you catch a cold in Melbourne. That's the analogy. So there's no boundaries anymore, and the world is a very complex place, increasingly complex, which creates risks for us as auditors about how we keep track of what's happening in our organisations and strategically what's going on in our organisations and the challenges that our leaders have to deal with, and therefore the challenges we have to deal with as an organisation. So one of the things we do a lot of in terms of myself and Andrew Brown in working with organisations and in some of the trainings we do with the IIA is about how we navigate through complexity, and we do some work in how we make sense of the vertical world. We use a model which is very helpful just to help drive perspective, and we do need perspective as auditors. It's something called the Integral Framework that I referred to in the at the start of the presentation, and Integral was developed by a guy called Ken Wilber, who he's written lots of books, but there's a very interesting book called The Brief History of Everything, which is it's a pretty interesting title. But the great thing about Integral is that it helps look at organisations in a holistic way. So it's a holistic perspective on organisational life. Is one of the more significant frameworks capable of taking into account the rapid rates of change and complexity emerging around the world, and it has significant application for your career, leadership, and organisational development. And it's important for us as we look to move towards trusted advisor status, certainly in my opinion, anyway. And it's a 4-quadrant model, very simple, really. But it talks to, if you look at the top, you've got the individual and the collective. And on the right-hand side, there's the tangible, and on the left is the intangible. So at all times, you have each of these perspectives at play. And if you look at your organisation, we look at systems, strategy, structures, technology. These are the things you're tangibly dealing with every day, which tends to be where auditors focus a lot of time on. But at the individual level, there's you, and there's your capability, your performance, your languaging, the accountability, your results, but also the behaviour of your leaders around the organisation and the people you work with. These are the things you can see. These are the tangible aspects of organisations and individuals. Top left is the intentional, or this is your iceberg, if you like. This is your attitudes, your engagement, your worldview, your sense-taking, and how you make perspective of the world. And of course, at all times, on all issues, in your organisation, there's also culture that's affecting everything. And it's the relationships, it's the politics, it's about how we do things around here. So when you're looking at any organisational issue, whether it's any audit issue for that matter, what's helpful is to be able to take a 4-quadrant perspective on each of those, because it deals with the tangible and the intangible, and each of those things are at play at all times at any given situation on all issues. So if you're able to take a plot in each of these quadrants, you can be more informed about how you make decisions and how you deal with issues in the organisation. And of course, interestingly, in terms of the audit world, we tend to focus in our approach and in our planning on these systemic, technology and policies issues, and looking at end-to-end systems, etc. But at all times, of course, all these other issues are at play. And that's useful to take that perspective in organisations and in your audit work. If you can take those other perspectives into account, it can help make more sense of things. So if you look at the integral framework in another way, the top left is about thoughts and feelings of the interior of the individual. The bottom left is the relationship and meaning of the organisation and the culture. The top right is your behaviour and actions, and how people do things and what you can perceive of them. And as an example, how your DISC style plays out in your behaviour and your communication. And then of course at the bottom right is the systems, strategy, process things that are at play at all times in all organisations. And of course that is a lot of where the traditional audit focus is, on those systems and strategy pieces. There's a whole bunch of material sitting under integral that we can't go into now, but I'll put it in there as a point of reference for you guys to think about when you're looking at doing things in your organisation and taking perspectives, particularly in the VUCA environment we live in. Integral is a really useful approach to taking perspective into what's happening in your organisation. So, when you're growing into this trusted advisor space, here's 10 behaviours that you could think about, and that relate back to the chart we showed towards the start of the conversation. If you look at the top, it's about passion, and these are not necessarily typical audit technical skills. These are about your behaviour. These are about how you communicate and how you relate to your customers. So it's about passion. Understanding your client needs, pretty important. It's about delivering and being reliable. It's about being authentic. So there's only one of you. Everyone else is taken. So this is about you being authentic with your customers. It's about getting close and personal. It's about connecting emotionally. This is something auditors, don't talk about as a part of the audit learning process, but it is about an emotional connection. How do you connect with your customers? People want to know you. They want to know what you like. They want to know that you put the customer needs before your own. It's about being credible. It's about long-term relationships. So we've reinforced again and again, it's about communication and relationships. You've got to be customer focused. You've got to put your customers first, and you've got to display genuine interest. So these are 10 behaviours that a trusted advisor displays with their customers in the organisation. And as an auditor, these are basic things you need to do with your customers if you want to become that trusted advisor. So if you have this desire to move towards trusted advisor status, and who doesn't? Well, everyone does. I mean, I ask, when we do trainings, I ask, as I said at the start, who wants to be a trusted advisor? And everyone does. And one of the reasons we do is because we want to feel valuable. We go to work, we want to feel relevant. Auditors often start behind the 8 ball when it comes to relationships, because it's the nature of the beast. It's like going to a dentist. People don't necessarily like getting audited, but if you can do your customer focus well, if you can develop your communication skills, if you can relate well with your customers, it's going to make the audit process, in terms of delivering your technical expertise, so much more easy. And it's about how you drive value for yourself in the workplace. Going to work, being an auditor, how do you be relevant for your customers? How do you drive value for yourself in terms of enjoying what you do every day? It's pretty important. So if there's a personal and collective development commitment required for both horizontal development, your technical skills, and vertical development. This is your mindset, your complexity of thinking. And doing these things involves both formal experiential learning programs, deep dives, understanding of self, emotional intelligence, unpacking why you do what you do, and on-the-job action learning, so stretch assignments, and coaching and mentoring as well on specific development issues. With my team at Post, we invested quite heavily into this relationship, communication, and emotional intelligence space, and did a lot of coaching and did a lot of work around lifting the level of capability of the team very broadly in terms of how we engage with our customer set. We use DISC, we use emotional intelligence coaching, a lot of stretch assignments, and we also invested in a lot of personal development work in terms of sending people on personal development programs to help surface their iceberg, to help resolve unresolved issues and getting clearer and clearer about themselves. When you can develop greater self-awareness, you can develop greater relationships, more effective communication skills, and you can move towards that trusted advisor status, which is what we did at Aussie Post. So just moving forward, so you want to grow into that trusted advisor. How are you going to know when you're there? How do you know if you're a trusted advisor? Well, the most simple way, from my perspective, is that your customers are going to tell you. We found at Post, when we developed, and we as I said, we invested heavily in the people relationship, customer focus, under self-awareness, emotional intelligence space, and we focused a lot of time on organisational strategy, what was really important for our senior executives, and focusing on those areas. What we found is that we became more in demand, we became much more relevant to our stakeholder set, and our customers started telling us, we want you guys around. So we moved into that trusted advisor status, not with every customer, but with certainly the majority of them. And when we did that, people enjoyed coming to work more, they got more value out of their work, they enjoyed their work more as an auditor, and it was just a better place to be, because we were being more relevant to our customers. And so your customers will tell you if you are getting towards that trusted advisor status. So in the final analysis, this is really important, in assessing your desire to grow towards trusted advisor, it really depends on one statement. And in the work that myself and Andrew Brown do, it really underpins everything we do, with the Institute of Internal Auditors and in other programs that we run. And it basically comes down to this. For you as an individual, the statement is, for things to change, first I must change. It's as simple and as complex as that. We talk about horizontal development and vertical development. It's about the willingness for you to change and improve and move towards trusted advisor status, and it takes work. And just as we close, in terms of the slides, the last of human freedoms is to choose one's own attitude. And this is about, you want to become a trusted advisor, you've got to do the work, and you can get there. Anyone can get there. It's really just a matter of how you focus, where you spend or invest your development time in terms of moving through those development stages, developing that complexity and ability to deal with the VUCA world and with your senior executives, and how you deliver your technical capability. So the question for each of you is, which pill are you going to take? Is it the red pill or the blue pill? And that's the big question. If you want to become a trusted advisor, you need to do some development, both as a team, and I know there's a lot of teams doing this around the place. In the program we ran in Melbourne last week, there's certainly a guy from the NAB, and from what he was relaying, the NAB's doing some great work in this space in terms of moving the team towards trusted advisor status. So there's a lot of people doing work, and who will already be there, and there's a lot of other people on the journey. But there's an investment required. And once you commit to it, it can be extremely rewarding. And I know from my experience as Chief Auditor at Post, compared to where we were at the start when I left, there was a huge change in terms of the perception of audit in the organisation. And one of the simple ways I say to people is to know whether I was successful, and whether the team was successful as as a team of auditors is that when I left the organisation, the board were kind enough to put on a board lunch in honour of the auditor who was leaving. And to me, that was a very simple way of recognising the audit team in terms of where they've gotten to, where the board was, keen enough to say thank you for doing a great job, internal auditor, and we want more of that. So there's a lot of reward in moving towards trusted advisor status, and it's where we all want to be. What I've got to say to you now is thanks for listening. We've got 3 or 4 or 5 minutes to take questions, and yes, you will be able to get a copy of the slides. That will be made available. And if you have any questions that you'd like to send to me offline or via email, obviously, you can give me a buzz, and that's my mobile number at the bottom, and certainly my contact email address. I'm more than happy to have a chat. I'll be happy to share some of my experiences in terms of how we moved the function at Australia Post up the value curve, and share some of my experience in doing some of the other stuff we do with organisations. So if there's anyone that would have any questions, happy to hear any questions you could post to me now. Otherwise, the slides will be made available, and be very happy to share them. So we have a question, which is an interesting one. Auditors are often caught in organisational politics. How can auditors evade these and come out clean as trusted advisors? Good question. Well, I don't think you can evade or avoid organisational politics. The question is what position you take in the political dimension of the organisation, and how authentic you are in dealing with your stakeholders. We have to be independent as auditors, and sometimes that means you've got to make hard calls and politically difficult calls. But that's why we get paid, and that's why we do what we do. It's about working through those political issues, and it's difficult to give you a clear answer because each individual is different, and each organisation is different. But you need to have political antenna, and you need to have very good social intelligence in terms of how you work through the political dimensions of any organisation. And if you look through the integral framework, politics and culture is pretty important. You need to have good antenna and understand what the politics is, for sure. Any other questions? Thanks for the feedback. It's a great session. Thank you. Keep them coming, folks. Thanks a ton. How have you found balancing this with the need for independence? That's a really good question. And you can be both a trusted advisor and quite independent as well. It's about your mindset and how you manage relationships. So it's important to be close to your customers, but it's equally as important to be independent. So you can do both of those very well. This is where the issue of complexity comes into play, and your level of development in terms of vertical development. So that's what I mean when I get to those issues of how we manage in complexity. That's one of the typical issues that auditors face. How we manage those polarities of maintaining independence while being close to our customers. And it is a mindset issue, and as Graham John, who was the CEO of Post, said to me, I need people who can handle complexity and ambiguity, and that's exactly what we need to do as auditors. One question is, do you have any comments on the intersection of trusted advisor and auditing risk culture? Yeah, I think auditing risk culture is something that we as trusted advisors or auditors really need to spend more time on, and is really important. And if you think about the integral framework and the bottom left component of organisational culture, culture affects everything. And we can audit end-to-end systems and processes, but if you don't understand how culture overplays and influences everything, then you're missing half the story. So I think auditing risk culture is critically important. for auditors, and having a good sense of ethical leadership in terms of how ethics is played out in an organisation is really important. I do a bit of work in the ethics space with managing values, and I see in organisations very clearly that while we often have codes of conduct and lots of good policies around, how their guides to behaviour, how they get played out in terms of how leaders behave in the organisation is often very different. And auditors need to have a very good pitch and understanding of how those things play out in terms of risk culture. And we can add a lot of value in that space, and we should be adding a lot of value in that space. A couple other questions. Where do I get the I Love My Auditor badges from? Good question. I don't have any. But we'll send the presentation around. Maybe you can cut some out and make some. Lots of thank yous, so thanks for that. And again, if there's any questions, certainly send through an email or give me a call. I believe it's a question here. I believe it's also your company's and management's appetite for auditors to move in this direction. That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, we don't live in a vacuum, and the appetite of the organisation is important. But how we can influence our senior executives and our board members to move in that direction is also important. And you know, we are implicated in that. So we can't be victims to the culture of our organisation necessarily. We can influence how the organisation perceives us. And this was certainly my lesson in terms of how we worked out the Australia Post example. It doesn't happen overnight though, I've got to say. Okay, so we're just finishing up with a few final comments. Another question or statement, where is the Hollywood blockbuster film being released, depicting the hero internal auditor? Good question around, you talked about in-house auditors. What about outsourced auditors? And that's an interesting and a significant challenge, I think, about how outsourced auditors are engaged and how they do relationships in the team. And be happy to talk to you about that in a bit more detail, because that's a slightly different challenge, but equally as important. Well, there we go. I Love My Auditor badge can be found here. Very good. Any other questions? As I said, feel free to drop me an email or give me a call, and be happy to have a bit more of a conversation in more detail with folks. So more time, it's 1:02, so we've probably got a couple more minutes. Thank you. Just reading through the comments.
Thanks for presenting today. I think it was very well received. I think there were lots of questions that came through. That was great, and there was lots of thanks. That's always a good indicator. That was really well liked and well received. So thanks for that. Just a very informative session. Guys, thanks for being a part of today's session as well. Really appreciate it. Don't forget there is that feedback form that pops open when this session closed down. Please do take the time to fill that in. Depending on your comments, it will take about 30 seconds. It will be great feedback for David, and also great feedback for Institute of Internal Auditors as well. Thanks again. Thanks, David. We'll see everyone again soon in another session. Take care.
Great. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.